Have so many of you with us tonight as we work through some very important issues for farmers, those issues about long-term care and how to protect our farm assets from the risks that long-term care poses. I'm Peggy Hall. I'm the director of OSU's Agricultural and Resource Law Program, and I'll be hosting tonight, and we have a couple of other speakers that will be joining us. My colleague Robert Moore is here, attorney with the OSU Ag and Resource Law Program, and we're partnering with Pennsylvania FarmLink to provide this webinar, and we hope we have some of you from Pennsylvania here on this evening. We'll introduce our other speakers here in a moment. Also want to thank the National Ag Law Center. We work with the National Ag Law Center, and we're a partner with them, and they provide us support for many of the programs and work that we do here at OSU. Just want to tell you a little bit, if you're not familiar, about our program at OSU. As I mentioned, it's the OSU Ag and Resource Law Program. And Robert, if you could go to the next slide, please. You can find our resources on farmoffice.osu.edu. We have joined together our legal team with our farm management team at OSU Extension, and we've provided this kind of one-stop shop for ag law and farm management information. You can find a lot of legal resources on here, as well as farm management resources. We have a law library that contains all of our legal publications, like the one that you'll see tonight, our long-term care publication. We also write the Ohio Ag Law blog, and you can go to this site and subscribe to that and receive our blog posts by email. And there's also all of the information about upcoming events related to ag law and farm management on the Farm Office website. So just wanted to make sure that you are aware of that. Even those of you in Pennsylvania may find it useful, but also I want to give some credit too. Over in Pennsylvania, you have Penn State's Shale and Agricultural Law Information Center, and they do a great job over there as well. So a lot there for you who are struggling with some of these legal issues and farm management issues that we face in agriculture. Also, we want to tell you about an upcoming conference. This topic of long-term care is one that many of our farm transition planners are discussing in agriculture. And Ohio State has joined together with Iowa State and the National Ag Law Center to create a new association of farm transition planners. And we will be planning our second conference for that new association that will be held this August 5th and 6th, here in Cincinnati, Ohio. So last year we were in Iowa. This year we're bringing it to Ohio. And we hope that those of you who work in this area of farm transition planning, whether you're an attorney, an accountant, a financial advisor, a care advisor, will find this new association and this conference useful. So more details will be coming out on our Farm Office website about that upcoming conference. So let me turn it over now to Robert Moore, who's an attorney with the OSU Agricultural and Resource Law Program. And this topic of long-term care was, I think, Robert's, was this your first? This was your first project. He began with us 2 years ago. I was so happy that he was ready to leave private practice and come over and work with me at Ohio State. And so the first project he did was this long-term care project, and he's been doing a lot of work, and I think you'll find it very useful and interesting. So Robert is going to introduce our other speakers tonight. Robert?
Okay. All right. With us behind the scenes is Jeff Lewis. Jeff is an attorney with Peggy and I at the OSU Ag and Resource Law Program. So throughout the evening, we would encourage you to ask questions, and you can do that by either submitting your question to the chat or the Q&A. There should be a button on your screen that lets you do that. So at any time, ask a question, make a comment. We'd much rather throughout the presentation just kind of have a conversation with you, address your questions. address your issues that you may have. So at any time, make a comment, ask a question, and we will be sure to get those to you on those. This point, I'll introduce Darlene, and Darlene, I'll let you introduce yourself and our special guest tonight.
Thank you, Robert. First of all, I would like to thank Robert and Peggy both, and as well as the National Ag Law Center for sharing their expertise with Pennsylvania and allowing us to adapt their publication for Pennsylvania as well, which is in the process of being done. That was very generous of them. And I'm Darlene Livingston from Pennsylvania FarmLink. I'm the executive director there, have been working with the organization for 15 years now. And when I came on board, I realized that farm succession planning was a huge issue, but along with that, we get into the whole topic of long-term care, because now that's of great importance and consideration when we're working through that with farmers. And also with us tonight is Dawn. She is a nurse case manager who helps families navigate health and long-term care needs and placement. She often works with families who need Medicaid assistance to pay for care, and those families do include farm families. So I'm very thankful that Dawn was able to join us tonight too, to share her expertise.
Okay, thank you. So the way we're going to do this is I'll get started on the first part of the presentation, and Peggy and I will work on this part. But again, Darlene and Dawn jump in at any point, and the same goes to the audience as well. A little bit of background, as Peggy mentioned. I was in private practice for about 18 years, working primarily with farm families. And long-term care was one of those topics that I always wanted to learn more about. But as some of you know, in private practice, you're kind of always worried about the next billable hour, and maybe you don't do as much research as you'd like to. So when I had the opportunity to join Peggy and Jeff at Ohio State, the first project I took on was long-term care planning, because I think we have a bit of a void in the agricultural community, in the long-term planning community, of people that know both farms and long-term care planning. So hopefully this presentation and the publication that Darlene mentioned can be of assistance to you, and hopefully we can all become a little better acquainted with long-term care planning in the farm. So Peggy, do you want me to just start in?
Sure, Robert, go ahead.
Okay.
And let's talk about some of that data you've put together that helps us understand what we might need in regards to long-term care.
All right. So yeah, we'll start out with just some data and statistics. What's the likelihood of somebody needing long-term care? What might that cost? Those kinds of numbers. So first of all, let's look at some national averages. And for some reason, that's not working. Well, let me tell you what is on the map that you can't see. So the national average for long-term care, it's about $60,000 for in-home care, and about $100,000 to $105,000 for nursing home cost. And then for state averages, there's quite a bit of variation, and not sure why I can't see that, but let me. You can indulge me for just a minute. I will correct this because I do want you to see this. This is part of doing live webcasts, so you are seeing it firsthand. Okay. Okay, can you see a map now? All right, sorry about that, computer glitch. So long-term care costs national average, as you can see, 60,000 for in-home care, 94 for a semi-private nursing home. And my understanding is that's usually two people in one room. If we look kind of throughout the Midwest, what kind of costs do we see? And there's quite a bit of variation. Ohio, fortunately, I guess we're kind of near the national average, as is much of the Midwest. But if you look, for those of you in Pennsylvania, unfortunately, you're a little bit higher. And if you're in Minnesota, you're a lot higher. So one of the things we're going to talk about next or later on is one of the first steps in long-term care assessment, as far as strategies that you may want to implement, is what does long-term care cost in your state, in your area. So if you're in Missouri, it's half of what it is in Minnesota. So it's really important to know what the costs are for your state. I do want to point out that you can find long-term care costs in your state and area. Genworth Financial, they're an insurance company, and they're kind of the gold standard of long-term care cost. So if you want to know what the long-term care is for your state, and then they break it down by city. So in Ohio, you can do Columbus, Cleveland, Toledo, the bigger cities. You can get those numbers for your state and city. So if your state isn't up here, just Google Genworth cost of care survey. It'll pop up, very easy to use, really nice source of information. So we have a little bit idea of what long-term care cost. Now, what are the odds? What do the statistics say as far as how many people will need it? So according to the Administration for Community Living, this is a federal agency, so I think we can have some confidence in these numbers, that if we look at the entire group of 65-year-old people, that 69% of that group will need some type of long-term care. So about 2/3 of people will need some type of long-term care. Now, how long will we need long-term care? So on average, it's 3 years. But there is a significant difference between women and men. So women live longer, so they tend to need longer care. So women will need on average about 3.7, men will need about 2.2 of long-term care. And just a little bit of a preview, long-term care includes both in-home care and nursing home care. When I was in private practice, one of the statistics that I got wrong, that I didn't discover until I did some research, I used to say the average nursing home stay was 2.21 years or 2.2 years. I was close. The average long-term care needs for males is 2.2 years. This highlighted section is, or bolded section is important, and we're going to focus quite a bit on this later. And that is 20% of those that will need long-term care will need it for longer than 5 years. So some of us are going to need long-term care for a number of years. And you probably all know somebody that has been in a nursing home for 5 years or 10 years or however long. So we hope that that doesn't happen to any of us, but we all know somebody who's been in that situation. So it certainly can happen. So anyway, that gives you a little bit of an idea of length of stay and the odds that any of us may need long-term care. So we know that on average, those that need long-term care will need about 3 years. Well, what does that 3 years mean? How does it break down? So if we take that 3 years, and again, this is all information from the Administration for Community Living again, we can break this 3 years down into about 2 years will be at-home care. So that's staying at home and either having a family member or hired care come in and take care of your needs. And then 1 year of facility care, probably a nursing home. And then we can further break that down in that the at-home care will tend to be 1 year of unpaid and 1 year of paid. So unpaid again would be a spouse, a family member that you would not pay. And then a paid care would be a service provider that would come in and take care of your needs. So we further break down of the 3 years that we'll need, 2 at home, and we'll have to pay for one of those years at home, 1 year in a facility. And so if we plug in the numbers that we started with, the unpaid home care obviously will cost $0. If we use the national average, the paid home care will cost around $61,000. Facility care will cost $94,000, $95,000. So that's $156,000. One thing I didn't mention earlier, and I should have, is, and maybe you noticed that these numbers, the cost numbers, are based on 2021 survey data. And I just checked yesterday, and that's still the most recent data they have. I'm not sure how often they update it. So with the inflation we've been having, just keep that in mind, that these are 2021 numbers. You probably could increase these by 10% pretty easily and be a little more accurate, but it gives us some idea of what we're looking at. So the average long-term care cost for those people that will need long-term care, let's assume that's in the $156,000 range.
Robert, I think Dawn has a comment.
Sure, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the Genworth calculator, in my opinion, is excellent in that you can go in there and put an inflation factor in between 3% and 5% and come up with an estimate for 2024. And I tried that with Pennsylvania and it looked totally accurate to me. I used 4% because in my experience, that's what we're seeing year to year in Pennsylvania. So there's an excellent way to continue to project forward with that tool.
So Genworth, you're vouching for it a bit, and in your experience, it's a pretty good source of cost information then.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so 3 years of care, around $150,000, $160,000. Let's look at that a little bit closer. So we know that 31%, about a third, are going to need zero cost. So that's great. We all hope we end up in the green part of this pie graph. But the other 2/3 averages 156,000, but that's an average. So some people will need much less than that. Some people will need more. And this is where we get into that 20%, that bolded, those bolded terms I had in there earlier. So about half will need something closer to 156, but it's that 20% that's going to need more than 5 years. And this is what I call the outlier scenario. And this, in my opinion, is the scenario that we probably ought to be planning around, since it's kind of the worst case scenario. And it also is going to have a much more significant impact on our farming operations. Because if we take that 20% and we plug in the numbers, so let's say that that 20% that's going to need 5 years of care, well, here are the cost of 5 years worth of care. So you see those numbers start to get pretty big. It could, needing these kind of resources to pay for long-term care could really put some financial strain on a farm. And what if we go to 7 years? Even bigger numbers, obviously. So, in Pennsylvania, if we're in the outlier scenario and maybe somebody is in a nursing home for 5, 6, 7 years, a big number that many farms may not be able to withstand. So my point about planning around the outlier scenario is, in my experience, most farms probably have enough to pay the average, because that average is 150, 160,000. None of us want to pay the first dollar, but I think most farms, if they had to pay 150, 160,000, they probably could do it, and they wouldn't have to liquidate farm assets to pay for it. I also think some farms can pay, or most farms can pay even a little bit above that average. So if we looked back at that pie chart and the 50% there, even if we get into the kind of upper part of that 50%, I still think most farms probably can withstand that. But if we get into the outlier, if we get into that 20% slice of the pie chart, especially as we get up into 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, then that's when I think many farms are going to have a hard time withstanding that financial pressure and potentially even having to sell land. And while farmers may not know they are worrying about the outlier scenario, I really think that's what they are worried about. And us as advisors are also worrying about that. I think if you told farmers and attorneys and financial advisors, I can guarantee you that you won't have more than $150,000 of long-term care cost in your life, I think just about everybody would take that deal. But the problem is we can't guarantee that, because some people are going to have 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. And so when we're doing planning, it's my opinion that what we're really doing is planning around that outlier scenario, those worst case scenarios, those situations that really can put a lot of financial strain on our farm. So as I mentioned before, we probably all know somebody who's been in a nursing home for many years, not the 1 year or 2.2 years we talked about earlier. Okay. So those are just some thoughts on data and statistics. Jeff, did we get any questions? Darlene, Dawn, or Peggy, any thoughts or comments? Okay.
I
All
have a
right.
question, Robert. It's a little bit off topic, but every time I hear this from you, the question in my mind is, why does it cost so much? And will we see a change in that here in the near future? We talked about, we need to, look at the escalation of those costs. In all your research, have you come across anything that would address that issue of trying to bring down the cost of long-term care? Or Dawn, do you ever hear much about that? Or do we just need to accept that these are the numbers we're going to be dealing with?
I don't have a good answer, so I'm going to defer to
No.
Dawn on this.
Okay.
I think you can expect it to continue to increase healthcare costs as a whole, and a lot of it is staff costs, supply costs, but most of it's staffing. Nursing homes and home care agencies, to get staff, the hourly rate is going higher and higher. I don't see it decreasing. I think if we could hold it at the 4% or so that it's, at least in my region, has tended to be a year, we'll be lucky. Unfortunately, it's healthcare costs as a whole.
No relief there.
I was going to say, I wish I had good news.
Well, so then, Robert, the question becomes, how do we deal with this risk? We have all these assets in a farming operation, but we can't give up all our assets or we won't have an
Right.
operation, right?
Right. So, one of the themes tonight you probably will hear a few times is, my opinion, there are no easy solutions when it comes to long-term care risk management, but there are some strategies that we can at least help reduce the risk. But before we get into strategies, a step that I think sometimes we forget to do, and that's doing a risk assessment. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And what I mean by a risk assessment is, what is the real risk to a specific farm? So we could compare two farms with, two 69-year-old people that own it, but the risk of long-term care to those farms could be very different, because we may have very different income, we may have very different assets, and we may have very different risk tolerances. So before we can know what strategy might be best, I think we have to say, what is the risk to this farm? I'm a firm believer that we need to do a risk assessment on a case-by-case basis. There is a law firm in Ohio that, it seems to me like, if somebody walks in the front door, they're walking out the back door with an irrevocable trust, and all their land's going to be in this irrevocable trust. And I've seen those plans come in to me, and sometimes I'll be like, why do you have this? You have plenty of income. You really have no risk to long-term care costs. So that's why I think we need to do it on a case-by-case basis. Some people will need some aggressive planning. Other people may not need anything. So the risk assessment looks at potential long-term care costs, which we've already looked at. What is the income potential to pay those costs? And then what savings, other financial assets might be. And only then can we gauge what is the actual risk to farm assets. Kind of a restatement there. Risk assessment is really required for good long-term care planning. So when I think about developing the risk assessment, how I think about it is, one, determine what the costs are for your area. So Genworth is a great source of information, like we already talked about, or talk to other people that may have family in a nursing home. Call up the local nursing home, call up the local care provider, see what they charge. But need to know what the long-term care costs are first. Then, do you have long-term care insurance available? We'll talk about that a little bit later, but obviously we need to factor that into the risk assessment. What after-tax income is available? After tax meaning, if you plan to make $50,000 of income, we know that you don't have $50,000 in your pocket after you pay tax. If you have to sell assets to pay for long-term care, we're going to have to pay capital gains tax or depreciation recapture on that first. So it's important to keep after-tax income in mind. What savings and investments are available, what operating assets are available, and then what is our risk tolerance for our land. So again, this is kind of how I think about the risk assessment. Maybe some of you have some different ideas, or maybe you put it in a little bit different order, but generally I think this is how we need to think about risk assessment as we work with different farming operations. So to kind of, when I was working on that, I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice to be able to kind of visualize that risk assessment? So I put kind of a simple spreadsheet together, what I call the long-term care risk calculator. And I'd like to just real briefly show you what that looks like. And you can download it at the farm office website, and it's free download. It's just an Excel spreadsheet. You can put it on your computer and use that for your own operation, or use it with clients. But again, it just kind of illustrates what I mean by a risk assessment. So let me go over to that. So this is the long-term care risk calculator. And the first page or the first tab, I did make a instruction video on YouTube, so gives you some details how to use it. A little bit what I'm gonna do tonight for you. And then there's the publication we'll talk about later. So down here, you can see there's a calculator for unmarried people and a calculator for married people. So tonight we'll just do unmarried. And so we start off with the risk assessment, what kind of in-home or expected need for in-home care. So just enter in, let's say we're going to have 1 year and 4 years. Let's say we're planning around that outlier scenario. In-home care, we just put in, let's put 60,000 there, and let's put 100,000 for a nursing home, and let's put 4% for increases, so we know our total cost is going to be around 484,000. What kind of retirement income are we going to have? Let's say 60,000, and let's say a 20% tax rate. So we know our total income 240. Let's assume we don't have any long-term care insurance. So we know that we're going to be short about $244,000. Okay. Our income is going to be about $244,000 short over the term that we need that long-term care. And then we move on down to the bottom of the calculator. I already put these numbers in earlier just to save some time, but it's just kind of a mini balance sheet. So let's say this person has $100,000 of cash in the bank, $50,000 of stocks, mutual funds, whatever it might be. Then we need to know what the tax basis is and the tax rate so we can calculate that after-tax value that will be there. And then I use liquid assets. You can change any of these assets to anything you want. You can change any of these values, but I use liquid assets such as grain, market livestock, and then operating assets such as machinery or livestock, and then land. And these yellow cells are really what the calculator is all about. So what this calculator or this calculation is telling us is that, I'm going to scroll back up here. If this person is in-home care for 1 year, nursing home care for 4 years, based on these expenses, this income, they can expect to consume all of their cash on hand, all of their financial assets, and half of their liquid farm assets. But the good news is operating assets are probably safe. Land is most likely safe. So again, it's just that risk assessment that we can plug into this spreadsheet. And then it's easy to go up here and say, well, what if I make $80,000 of income? And then you come back here and then obviously the numbers change. So it's just a real simple tool that you might find useful for your own farm or working with clients, that you can do that risk assessment and kind of visualize what that might look like. And again, that is available at the Farm Office website. Okay, so let's do some risk assessment examples to kind of show you what I'm talking about. So let's do an unmarried person. Let's do a nursing home cost of $90,000 a year. There's some of their assets, and we're going to have $70,000 of retirement income, $250,000 of savings. So if we do the average scenario, that's the 3 years of care, 1 year unpaid in-home, 1 year paid, and 1 year in a facility. That's the average scenario. See, this person has enough income to pay for almost all of the care, and there's plenty of cash there to pay the deficit. So if this person were to come in and say, hey, I'm worried about long-term care, I'm worried about losing the farm, we better do an irrevocable trust, I'm going to say, are you sure about that? Because if we're just worried about the average scenario, it's really unlikely that your farm assets are going to have to be spent down on your care. But we do need to talk about that outlier scenario. But even in this case, the income will take care of even the outlier scenario. Let's say that 5 years of care. So if it's an outlier scenario, we may have to spend down all of the cash, but we still have the final financial assets as kind of a buffer. And so in this case, even in the outlier scenario, I would still tell this person, I probably wouldn't do anything real aggressive. You've got enough cash, you've got enough income. Your farm assets, the odds of them being at risk are really small. I probably wouldn't do any real aggressive planning. Now, if they say, I want zero chance of any of my farm assets having to be sold for long-term care, maybe we would do it then, but that's the only scenario I would really see that we'd want to get real aggressive on this. So example 2, let's do a similar situation, but now we have a married couple. So with married couples, we have twice the possibility of maybe needing long-term care. So if we go to the calculator on this, if we go the average scenario where both spouses could potentially need 3 years of care, we're still pretty good. We probably would consume all of the cash. Financial assets are okay. And our farm assets are probably safe because we've got enough income and financial assets to take care of that. But if we go to the outlier scenario, see, now we're starting to cut into the farm assets. And this would be, if I was talking to this couple, this is the couple I would say, it's kind of a close call. If we're just planning around the average scenario, you're good. I probably wouldn't do anything. If we're planning around kind of the worst case outlier scenario, even then your land is probably safe. But, it is a possibility that if it goes 7 years, 10 years, land could have to be sold. So this is kind of that, maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. Let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages, and then let you decide if you want to do some aggressive planning like an irrevocable trust or gifting. But if they say, no, I think we're okay, this is acceptable risk, I'd be okay with that too. And then example 3 would be just an unmarried person with modest income, modest savings, and their only asset is farmland. You probably all know somebody like this. For the average scenario, we're going to use up all the cash very quickly and even start in on the land. If we do the outlier scenario, land is being sold. So it's for that person that maybe is just living off some rental income, Social Security, and doesn't have much in savings. That's the kind of scenario where their land is at risk, their farm assets are at risk. And this is the type of client that I would say, your land's at risk. If you want to protect the land, we better look at doing some aggressive planning, like an irrevocable trust, like some gifting. So anyway, that's a little bit about the risk assessment, kind of how I think about it, and how we can pretty easily do a risk assessment for each individual farm. So any questions or comments on that? Okay. My rule is I keep talking until somebody asks a question. So if you want to keep me from talking, ask a question at some point. All right, let's talk a little bit about Medicaid. We really can't talk about long-term care planning without at least some discussion on Medicaid. So before we talk about Medicaid, let's talk about Medicare. Medicare, as most of you, probably all of you know, is essentially a health insurance program for older people. It will pay for long-term care cost on a short-term basis. like if it's rehab or recovery from a procedure of some kind, but it's not a long-term solution. So I'm not going to talk about Medicare much other than just saying it can help in the very short term, but Medicare is not a long-term solution for long-term care. Medicaid is a joint and federal state program. So we're going to look at some of the different qualifications here in a little bit. And you'll notice some of the numbers are a little bit different between the states. So that's because the federal part of Medicaid makes some rules, and then the states can make their own individual rules. So it's important that you know what the Medicaid rules are for your state. So I'll be using Ohio numbers for my examples and what I talk about tonight. But if you're not in Ohio, make sure you check out those numbers for your own state, and don't rely on the numbers I show you if you're not in one of those states, because they could be slightly different for you. But Medicaid, for the purposes of what we're going to talk about tonight, essentially will pay for someone's medical care, medical needs, long-term care, if they do not have the resources to pay for the care themselves. So we don't want people out on the street that can't pay their medical bills. So Medicaid is that social program that we've decided we need to help people out who may not have the resources to pay for their own care. So there are income limits to Medicaid. It's a relatively easy way to get around income limits, so I'm not going to talk about those tonight. The asset limit is what is often the hardest part for a farmer to qualify for Medicaid, because as you can see, you can own very few assets and qualify for Medicaid. So if you're a single person, you can't own more than a couple $1,000s of assets and qualify for Medicaid. If you're married, it's higher, because we want the spouse that's not in the facility, we want them to have some resources so they can take care of themselves and they can live, but it's still not very much. And so almost no farmers are going to qualify for Medicaid without aggressive planning, because they're all going to be over these asset limits by quite a bit most of the time. But that gives you some idea of the numbers. If your state isn't up here, it's really easy to find these numbers. Just go to the American Council on Aging. They've got a great website. You can just plug in your state and these numbers will pop right up. So this is a great resource to find out what the income and asset limits are for your state. So when we're looking at the asset limit as to how do we get qualified, there are some assets that are not included in that $2,000 or $3,000 or $156,000, whichever number applies to you. So the home is typically not included, provided that you are anticipating going back to the home, because if somebody has to sell their home before they can qualify for Medicaid, well, if they don't have a home to go back to, they're probably always going to stay in the care facility. So by making the home exempt, they have a place to go home to if they're able to recover and leave the facility. Automobile, Medicaid is generous enough to allow us to have a burial plot and not count towards our $2,000. Some retirement accounts, some property used in trade or business can be exempt. But the critical thing is here, even though those assets are exempt from determining that initial $2,000 or $156,000, Medicaid very well may put a lien on those assets. so that when, let's say your house is exempt and you qualified for Medicaid, if you haven't sold your house already, when you pass away, Medicaid will have a lien on your house, and they will expect to be paid from proceeds from that house. In Ohio, they're fairly aggressive at that. Every time we have an estate, we have to send a letter into the state Medicaid office saying this person died and we're going to transfer this real estate. And then they'll say they don't have any Medicaid liens, go ahead, or they'll say there are Medicaid liens, do not transfer that property. So some states are pretty aggressive. Others, I think, are much more lax. So it depends on the state you're in as to how critical this issue is. But in Ohio, it's a pretty serious issue. 5-year look back. So you've probably all heard of this, and this is the rule that one of the reasons that long-term care planning is challenging and hard, because when we're doing long-term care planning, a lot of times we're trying to guess what 5 years down the road is going to look like. And that's the 5-year look back rule. And what this rule is basically, it prevents someone who is going into the nursing home tomorrow from just gifting all their assets away today and becoming eligible for Medicaid. If it was that easy to do, that's what everyone would do, and Medicaid would become insolvent pretty much immediately. So what the rule says is if you have made any gifts in the last 60 months, or what's technically called an improper transfer, if you've transferred any assets for less than fair market value, then you are ineligible for Medicaid for some period of time. And how much that is depends on your state rules again. But in Ohio, for every, let's call it $7,500 of gift you make, you're ineligible for 1 month of Medicaid. So if you make if you've made $100,000 gift, you'll be ineligible for 14 months. If you make $1 million gift, you're ineligible for 135 months. But if you make $1 million gift and then you wait 60 months to apply for Medicaid, it's no longer an improper transfer. So timing of Medicaid application is very important, because you don't want, if you've made $1 million gift, you do not want to apply for Medicaid until this 60 months has passed, or you could be ineligible for 135 months after the time you apply. So this might be one reason to talk to someone like Dawn, who can help you navigate these kind of rules. But the Medicaid strategy is basically this: is you get assets out of your name that you want to protect. So you either put them in an irrevocable trust, you gift them to family members, however you need to do it, whatever works best for you. You get those assets out of your name, you wait 5 years, and then those assets are protected from nursing home. So that's the Medicaid strategy. Disadvantages of Medicaid: you may not get to select your care facility. Not all facilities accept Medicaid. You're probably not going to be eligible for a private room, so you'll probably have a roommate. Maybe you think that's a good thing, but if you want a private room, you probably won't get that with Medicaid. The third point I always think is kind of interesting, because I'll have people say to me, farmers are pretty independent people. I wish the government would stay out of my business. Well, if you're going to go on Medicaid, the government is not getting out of your business. In fact, they are going to be taking care of you. So just keep that in mind. Medicaid's a government program, for good or bad. That's what it is. And you will be heavily reliant upon the government for your care. This next point's kind of interesting, and I'll ask Don to comment on this because I get asked a lot by people when I do this presentation that, you know, do you get the same level of care with if you're if Medicaid is paying for your care versus if you're private pay? And I think it's a great question to ask. So Don, could you comment on that a little bit?
Sure. In terms of if you're looking at one nursing facility and there's people who are there self-pay, 100% paying for their care versus Medicaid, they're actually going to get the same level of care. The caregivers don't have any idea what the payer is. Is it an insurance company? Is it Medicare? Is it Medicaid? Is it self-pay? Typically, in a skilled nursing facility, the only people that know that information is the billing office, the staff that processes admissions and does the assessments to see if you're appropriate for that level of care. So that's usually a nurse admission coordinator or sometimes a social worker. And depending on the facility, the director of nursing may know. Facilities typically, if they take Medicaid patients, typically have certain number of, they talk about it as a certain number of beds, Medicaid beds, male and female, but they're not literally specific beds. It's just a census. And part of what happens is if a facility took only Medicaid patients, Medicaid reimbursement typically does not cover their actual cost of care. So they can't afford to have everybody in their facility as a Medicaid patient. So that's why there's a certain number of beds or admission numbers of people that can be in the facility on Medicaid. That said, back to your first point, you may not get to select your care facility. There are fewer, not every nursing home takes Medicaid, so there are less choices. Because there's limited beds, there can be significant waits. Give you an example, not too long ago, I was working with a family and we anticipated that the family member was going to need skilled nursing care. And we knew that they were going to very quickly need to be on Medicaid because of the resources they had. When I started looking at facilities where they might be a good spot to consider, I was hearing that and I typically will ask if they don't have beds, what's your waiting time? What's your waiting list look like? And I was getting answers like 6 months, 7 months before there's a bed available. Unfortunately, sometimes the places that have more beds available for Medicaid patients aren't necessarily the facilities that have the highest inspection scores, ratings, etc. So in that regard, they do in the same facility, you will receive the same level of care, but your choices may not be as broad. Is
Do you
that
see any
answer?
do you see any differences in facilities between I'll say urban or, you know, suburban versus rural? Maybe a little bit better in one place, or is it pretty consistent?
I would say rural settings, because we tend to have fewer beds available, fewer skilled nursing facilities for the population, it can be more difficult. The other thing that I see is when you're in an area where there are, I mean, this is good and bad, there are retirement communities where there's all the levels of care. And to me, that's the ideal setting. You know, maybe you need personal care to start or some assisted living, but then you can move up through that they have a skilled nursing facility. Problem is that there's typically not enough skilled nursing beds available, readily available. And I'm seeing retirement communities that if I were to call them and say, do you have any skilled nursing beds available, even if it's a self-pay? I'm getting told that they aren't accepting any applications from anybody who isn't already living in that community, places that have their own independent living facilities, etc. Now, this is not really necessarily applicable to farmers. You're not going to leave the farm probably and go live in a total care kind of retirement community, perhaps. But if you weren't in that situation, one of the things I would say to people is, consider that when you're looking at housing options, because in some regards, you're picking your nursing home should you need them. But it's complex. Finding good beds in good facilities can be difficult.
And, I was talking about, we got this 5-year look back rule that is challenging, but it's based on what you're saying. It's not just that, but maybe the limited bed space. You need to be planning well ahead of time. You're not going to call up and get in a facility tomorrow, especially if maybe you have limited resources. Is that fair to say?
Yes, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. All right. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about numbers and datas and cost, and talked about how do we assess a risk for individual farms, covered Medicaid. Let's get into now some of the strategies that can be implemented to at least try to reduce the risk that long-term care may have on our farming operations. So these are the strategies I'm going to talk about tonight. There are other strategies, and how I describe them might be a little bit different than other people would describe them and think about them. But they're just some of the tools that we have in our toolbox that we'll talk about. Again, this isn't an exhaustive list. You should go see someone who, whether it's an attorney or a care provider, somebody who knows these strategies, know what might work best for you. So make sure you talk to somebody who's knowledgeable before you implement any of these strategies for yourself and for your farming operation. Personally, my preferred strategy is long-term care insurance, because if we have long-term care insurance that covers all the costs, we don't have to gift assets away. Everything's covered. Everything's great. Why don't we all have long-term care insurance, right? Well, as a lot of you probably know, one, it can be costly, although there are many different types of policies. For example, when my wife and I were looking at long-term care, it was a little pricey, but our financial advisor mentioned that there's a policy where you have to self-pay the first year, and then only after the first year does the insurance policy pay out. And by taking that policy, reduced the premiums quite a bit and made it affordable for us. You can get long-term care cost and essentially life insurance policies together, so that if you don't use it for long-term, your heirs can get a death benefit from it. So a disadvantage is it can be costly, although you should certainly check into it and price some policies. Second is not everybody's insurable. So if you've got some significant, it's very possible that you just simply may not be insurable. Don, do you have anything to add about long-term care insurance?
It's unaffordable for a lot of people. And typically the prices are going up quickly. So it's worth looking into, definitely. There's various options, life insurance with a long-term care rider that I'm aware of. So it's worth looking at. Don't think that's going to be the whole answer.
Yep.
Which you're not insinuating that it is either.
Yeah. But,
You know,
and there's only just a handful of insurance companies that even offer it anymore. So, I tell everybody, look into it, but understand that for many people, this is not going to be the strategy that's available to you. The do nothing strategy. So, this is what most people choose, I think, from my experience. Some people really don't have any choice. They don't have the resources available where they can gift a lot of assets away and still live. So many people don't really choose the do nothing strategy. It's the only strategy that is available based on their resources and their situations. So I don't mean this as a do nothing strategy of, it's necessarily a bad thing. It's maybe a necessary thing. Also, the do nothing strategy is the appropriate strategy for maybe people that have adequate income and or savings. So that if you've got enough income that, you're probably going to be able to pay for long-term care, even if it extends into that outlier scenario, then probably the do nothing strategy is right for you. So if you have chosen the do nothing strategy, don't think you're doing anything wrong. It may be the appropriate strategy for you. Gift assets. So this is where you would gift assets to someone. And while I'm thinking of it for Medicaid purposes, spouses are considered the same people. So really doesn't do any good for most assets to gift to spouses. You need to gift to children or other family members, whoever it may be, but you gift those assets away. You get through the 5-year look back period, and then those assets don't have to be spent down for your care. So that's the gift strategy. The advantage is relatively inexpensive. If you're doing real estate, you may need a few deeds. If you're gifting machinery and livestock and grain and crops, that's pretty easy to gift. Disadvantage, obviously, you don't own it anymore. A gift is a gift. So if you gift your land away to your children, you don't own it anymore. You don't control it legally. Now, hopefully your children would still listen to you, but legally, once you gift it, you have no control over it. So just keep that in mind. And probably the thing I worry about the most with gifts is, what if you gift it to your children and they get into financial difficulties? They have a lawsuit, whatever it may be. So keep that in mind for gifts. So gift is an easy strategy, an inexpensive strategy, but it certainly does have its own risk with it. I get this question a lot, and that is, what happens if you gift assets away to try to protect them from long-term care cost, but before the 5 years, that 5-year look back period is up, you run out of money. So you don't have any money to pay for long-term care. 5 years has not expired. So Medicaid tells you you're eligible. What do you do? So those gifts either need to be returned and spent down for your care, or the people you gifted to need to pay for your care. So whenever we have done strategies where we're gifting to, usually it's children, I like to have the children there when we do this and say, look, you need to understand, if mom and dad go in a nursing home in the next 5 years and run out of money, you have to understand you've got to take care of them. You've got to pay their bills. So that's how I like to handle that. You can apply for a hardship. I've not had any experience with this, but you can say, I gifted my assets and they're no longer around, and the people I gave them to don't have any money. I would not want to rely on hardship. Don, do you have any experience with hardship?
I don't. I haven't
Yeah.
encountered filing for that.
Yeah. So don't rely on hardship. I think if you're going to gift assets away, make sure the people you are gifting to understand the implications. So the irrevocable trust strategy is similar to gifting, as you essentially gift assets to an irrevocable trust. And by getting those assets out of your name, you give up ownership and control. Since you don't own them, then they don't have to be spent down for your care. And normally you would name maybe a family member, a child as trustee. The advantage to the irrevocable trust is you can put provisions in there so that if you put it in the irrevocable trust and a child gets into financial difficulty, it doesn't jeopardize the land or whatever assets you put in there. So there is some security. You can do some estate planning with that irrevocable trust that you can't do with just straight gifting. The downside of an irrevocable trust is it can be expensive. They're complex documents, and they're irrevocable, meaning you can't change it. So once you set an irrevocable trust strategy in motion, that's what's going to happen, and we have limited ability to change that. Self-insure, so this would just be where you set money aside, or maybe you like most farmers, you can't hang on to cash very well and you have to buy that farm that's for sale. Maybe you just say, I'm going to buy the farm, but if I do need long-term care, I'll sell this farm to pay for it. Or, you do save up some cash. So self-insure is a great strategy. It really doesn't cost anything to do. The disadvantage is how much do you need? I call this the impoverished spouse issue. This happened to my parents. My dad went into a nursing home and they had self-insured, but there was no way to know how long my dad was going to be in there. So my mom didn't know how much money she was going to need for his care. So she basically spent no money on herself while he was in the nursing home. So that's one of the disadvantages I see to self-insure, but it can be a very good strategy, and it worked out well for my parents. So next to the insurance strategy, this is probably my strategy for many farm operations, and that's kind of wait and see. I'm reluctant just to give assets away or put them in an irrevocable trust, because what if you're in that 1/3 group of people that never have $1 of long-term care? Or what if you're in that group that you're average or less than average long-term care? You could give away all of your land and have very little or no long-term care costs to be like, well, why did I do all that? So a lot of times what I advise clients to do is let's wait and see what happens. If it looks like somebody is going to go in a nursing home, and that may be an extended period of time, then let's hold back 5 years worth of assets. That 5 years of assets are at risk, but then we can go ahead and gift or put in an irrevocable trust. So I like this plan because it does allow us at least some flexibility. It does reduce the unknown aspect somewhat of long-term care planning, but the disadvantage is we're always going to have 5 years worth of assets at risk. So, none of these strategies are perfect. None of them are foolproof, but at least they help reduce the potential risk that long-term care will have on our farming operations. Any thoughts or comments on those strategies, or any questions? Okay, well, I'm going to finish up with just a little bit of a conclusion then. And I like graphical things, if you haven't noticed by now, between my calculator and my different slides. So I just thought we'd summarize with kind of this decision flow chart that I put together, just kind of go back through what we talked about. So as we're trying to figure out how do we make a decision on what do we do about long-term care, I think the place to start is let's estimate our cost, and we can use the Genworth that's available online to do that. Then let's project our income and any insurance we will have. And then we ask the question, will insurance/income cover our long-term care cost? If the answer is yes, we're probably done. You probably don't need to gift assets away. You use your income, pay for those costs, and hopefully you're in that category. That's the category to be in. if insurance and income will not cover cost, then I think the next question is, do we want to try to protect assets from long-term care by using Medicaid? If the answer is yes, I want it to try to qualify for Medicaid, then we determine what assets you want to protect. And then after we have passed that 5 years, all those assets are protected. We'll say any assets that you keep in your name, those will have to be spent down. So it's important to assess what assets should be given away versus what assets you want to retain. If you don't want to qualify for Medicaid, the next question is, will savings cover long-term care? Savings plus income plus insurance. If the answer is yes, we can stop there. If the next question is, if income, insurance, and savings is not enough, will non-real estate cover cost? If yes, we can stop there. Where we don't want to get to for most farmers, and I would say probably every farmer, is we don't want to get to this block where we've used up all of our other assets. We're still in a nursing home, and now we've got to sell land to pay for long-term care. So we really don't want to get to this point. And there's many different places up in here where we can make a turn to the right and keep our land safe. So if you're worried about, keeping your land for the next generation and its impact on or its how at risk it is to long-term care, as long as you do some planning ahead of time, work with somebody, make some informed decision, there's a pretty good chance that you can minimize the risk to your land, but you do have to plan ahead. So in conclusion, no easy solutions for long-term care planning. Let's assess the risk for each farm. What is the true risk? And then the best strategy depends on that risk assessment. Each situation is different. The planning should reflect each different situation. And then I like to think about it as, we have little control over if we end up in a nursing home or long-term care facility. And I know Don's going to talk about this, but we do have options as to how to plan for those costs if we do end up in long-term care. Darlene had mentioned this publication earlier. This is the publication I put together, which is mostly focused on Ohio numbers, but it certainly has application throughout the country. Darlene, I know you're in the process of, updating it or modifying it to Pennsylvania and maybe some other states. Do you want to talk about where you're at on that?
Sure. We're actually updating it for Pennsylvania specifically ourselves. And we have updated numbers and things like that. And it is actually at the printer going through like an edit aspect to get everything plugged in. So we will have that in the near future for Pennsylvania. And I do know Joy Kirkpatrick and her group at the University of Wisconsin are planning to do the same thing for Wisconsin.
Okay. So
But it's definitely, for me, it was one of the best resources I've seen for farmers in layman's terms. So I felt it definitely was is a great resource.
Okay. All right. Great.
Robert, a
And-
couple of questions here
okay.
before we move over to Dawn and Darlene. One is, at what age do you recommend kind of making this risk assessment? Is there a certain point where it's the most important thing you need to do at age X? Any thoughts on that?
It's a great question. I tell people that you need to start looking at long-term care insurance, at 50 or under. Because if you wait till 70, it's probably not going to happen. So I think I'll say 50 for long insurance and younger. You know, look at it when you're 20. Now, 20-year-olds are not going to do that, but the younger, the better. After that, you know, I don't know. Don, do you have any thoughts? We've always got that 5-year look out. So, you know, for some people, they start planning at 90 and they're just fine. Other people, 60 or 65, you know, they may need long-term care. So I don't have a good answer, but I'm curious to hear what Don might say.
Well, I don't know. In my mind, if you're relatively healthy and not dealing with fairly significant chronic illness issues, one way I will talk to people is when you're applying for Medicare, start thinking about this. You know, especially if you're a farmer, honestly, it's kind of, maybe Medicare helps you trigger, like, we need to talk about this. We need to be thinking about it. On the other hand, if you're someone who's dealing with a chronic illness, cancer diagnosis, situations that have the potential to have some pretty serious consequences if all doesn't go particularly well, start thinking about it. In that regard, if those were the situations, whether you'd qualify for long-term care insurance, you might not be as likely to qualify, but at least start planning. What if? Now, I'm also the kind of person who tends, as a nurse, tends to run the what if scenarios anyway. So perhaps I'm skewed a little bit that way.
What about family history? Are there certain, I don't know, family medical issues that if your parents, grandparents had that might suggest you might be more at risk? What do you think?
Cancer,
Okay.
cardiac, dementia would be the three on the top of my list. Yes, I would agree.
Okay, great.
Good,
All right,
thank
well, what
you,
other
Don.
questions we got?
Well, it's a comment, I think, more than a question, but it's something that I was thinking about too, actually, when you were back in the beginning talking about national average costs for long-term care. The comment is that we didn't address adult day services or adult day health care services. How does that affect long-term care? And the attendee is commenting that Genworth ranks that type of care at about half the cost of assisted living, so slightly different. Does Genworth consider that in their averages, or is that really a separate category of care that we're not addressing here when we speak about long-term care?
I can tell you it is a separate category that I didn't address as part of this. It's really nice having an expert here because I can just say, Don, what do you think about this? This is great. Can you do every presentation with me?
Well, I helped with the edit to Pennsylvania. I did add it.
Okay.
But it's sort of a stepping stone. So if you aren't familiar with adult day health, and it isn't available everywhere, but it can be a stepping stone between being at home and family care and so on, versus needing to be in assisted living where you're going and living at that facility. So what happens with adult day health, if it's available, is, and the programs vary, so this is just a generality. It can be where either there's transportation provided, or you transport the individual to a setting, which is typically breakfast and lunch is provided. Some of the programs have nursing staff who will help shower someone. Medications are administered, some treatments. And one of the things that this can help with is if there's a family member they're providing care, but they need to be working their job as well, or a farm. you've got a couple perhaps that are both working on the farm. Is someone going to be able to stay in the house with this individual if that's what they need? So it's just a way to another sort of level of care. And an added benefit is that there's socialization, there's activities going on. They sometimes do, outings and so on. So versus someone needing care sitting in the house by themselves, whether they're sharing a home with their family or on their own, it can be another step. Rarely is no insurance is going to pay for that. Sometimes if Medicaid has certain options around community care, you might get it in there. But it's typically going to be a self-pay. Now, some long-term care policies will include that level of care as something that they will cover if you qualify.
So if you do have a very serious medical condition, it might not be an option. Am I hearing that correctly?
Could be. I mean, most of the adult day health programs can handle a wheelchair-bound individual, but it's, other than administering medications, it's non-medical care, so it doesn't qualify as skilled nursing care, for example. But it's less costly than if someone moves to an assisted living or a personal care setting, because there you've got the housing and the meals and so on. So that's going to be a more costly option.
And the attendee commented that the Veterans Administration uses it. So it could be helpful to those who are veterans. Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. If an individual is a veteran, looking at what benefits they might have available to them is always a good option.
Okay, there are several questions. Robert, if you want to take a look at those, and why don't we, do you want to review those and answer them now, or let's turn and talk to Dawn and then we can come back to these questions at the end? Your choice, Robert.
Yeah, Don, why don't you start in? I'll take a look at the questions and we can address those maybe as you're talking or towards the end.
Yeah, so let's turn over to, I believe Darlene and Dawn are going to talk a little bit, some questions and answers that we might have on just how do you go about arranging care and what does that look like and what are some of the issues. So let's hear from the two of you on that.
Well, I'll turn it over to Dawn in just a second. I do want to say one of the most challenging situations I get into is when a farm family calls me and says, Dad's been in a nursing home for a month. We don't want to lose the farm, and that sort of thing. And when we start to talk about assets, as we just learned, there's a wide range of having assets, not having assets. Usually the people who are calling are the ones actually running the farm, but the farm may still be in Dad's name or whatever. So it's just, to me, this topic is so very important because as Robert talked about, planning and at least looking at the options, learning as much as you can about this is very helpful. So I'll turn it over to Dawn because she has the real expertise in the subject matter, working with families.
Well, I had a couple of points, but Darlene, you triggered one for me when you said, Dad may need nursing home care and what do we do here? I had that experience with my father, and we had made a transition. He found it difficult to make that transition because it's hard to let go of land. But we had, and we knew that we were going to have, if he needed care in skilled nursing, we were going to have self-pay bill that was going to be pretty large. But part of the planning, we were ready for that. But I will never forget, I lived 4 hours away when he had to be admitted to the hospital, knowing he was going to have to go to skilled nursing. And the nurse manager on that unit knew of our farm. And I'll never forget her meeting me in the hall and said, please tell me that the farm is not still in your dad's name. You know, she understood the gravity of what the potential was. So we were in a position where we had done planning and we were grateful that we did it. One of the things I was saying to Robert before we started, if I had one thing to say to people, it's not going to be popular. I know that. Do not promise your family member that you will never, the quote is usually, the family member will say, don't ever put me in a home, meaning a nursing home. Number one, if you're the person that's inclined to say that, don't. And if you're the family, please try not to. That's your intention, and you'll do everything you can. But the diseases that we face are the diseases. We don't know what's going to happen. Dementia, some other illnesses, people get paranoid, they hallucinate, they get violent. You may not be able to handle that in the home setting as much as you'd like. And unfortunately, I have seen caregivers, particularly spouses, who made that promise and sometimes are physically dealing with anger, hitting. It's just, you can't promise something you can't guarantee. And that's got to be one of the toughest situations. So just be thoughtful if you're in a position being asked that. There's lots of good options. Certainly there are challenging options too, but there's a lot of ways to provide care. Another thing that I think about is people don't want to consider hospice. They don't want to consider palliative care, and that's because we don't necessarily understand what it is. But hospice and palliative care benefits are typically in every single health insurance policy. It's covered by Medicare. You may not realize that hospice care, for example, which the definition is the last 6 months of life, but they don't kick you off if you don't pass away in 6 months. Hospice and palliative care professionals, I call it, they have magic tricks. They know how to use medications and how to work with folks to keep them comfortable. That's what it's about, is comfort care. With palliative care, you can still be getting treatment for diseases and illnesses, but also getting expert comfort care. And hospice, same, you don't continue your treatment. Like if you had cancer, you would have stopped treatment specifically for the cancer, but you get help that's comfort care. And what most people don't realize is, for instance, hospice care comes with extra services. So you can have someone who's in a nursing home be placed on hospice and get extra one-on-one health home or health aides, certified nursing assistant, extra hours of one-on-one care in the skilled nursing care facility, at home, wherever. Also, there's some expenses, such as some medication copays, that hospice will pick up, some supplies that normally you would have to pay for that hospice will pick up. So many people miss that benefit if they aren't aware, or there's the stigma in using it. So that's just something that I think about. Plus the family gets bereavement support afterwards, which can be very helpful. When my mother passed away, my father was certainly not the kind of individual who was going to see a counselor or anything. But the hospice team that he had come to know came to visit, brought him materials, made it clear that he could talk to them. That was helpful for him, and he was willing to accept that. So those are some of my pet things, I guess.
Dawn, can you back up for a moment? How is hospice typically paid for?
Well,
I'm not sure I understand
hospice, yeah, hospice services under Medicare, there's a hospice benefit. So, physicians and nursing staff. But and I don't understand all the details, but for instance, if someone's at home on hospice, sometimes some of the supplies that you would have to pay for you know, incontinence pads underneath someone, just various things. Some of that will be paid for by the hospice benefit as well as medications for comfort, pain control, and so on. And when I say some of the magic, even if somebody can't swallow food, they have liquid medications that you can they will prescribe that you can use to keep somebody comfortable. So and they are very good at finding ways to keep people comfortable. I mean, my father was on hospice at the end, and the first time the hospice nurse saw him, she said, he's in pain. And he wasn't necessarily able to articulate that. Plus, he's a farmer. He was tough. You don't ask for pain control, He had arthritis really bad. And she said, he is in pain laying in this bed. And so they got him some medication and he actually relaxed and clearly felt better. So those are things that you don't get otherwise necessarily.
One thing I'd like to share too about hospice that I thought was amazing. My mother-in-law was on hospice at the end of her life, and it happened to be during the COVID shutdown. And, as we all know, not family members weren't always able to be with them. Well, we had a hospice professional that came in and sat with his mother, my mother-in-law. And when it came towards her end of life, she was amazing. She got everybody on the phone and they were all able to verbally talk to their mother before she passed away, even if she wasn't able to communicate. They all had that satisfaction that they were able to say final goodbyes and things. And I don't think they would have had that opportunity without the hospice health aide sitting there. And I just thought that that was really an amazing gift for the family to have.
And I know in my community that there is a hospice provider that's a nonprofit organization, and I know there's a lot of funding and donation and fundraising that goes into that. So that would certainly affect that cost question as well.
Right.
Okay.
And hospice, depending on where you're at, hospice can occur in the home. It can occur in a nursing home. It can occur in a hospital. In some areas, actually, there are hospice homes. If a family is unable to provide care at home, but they don't need a nursing home, for example. Sometimes that's an option. It's not everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Other comments or questions for Dawn or Darlene?
Why don't I'll address some of these questions now.
Good.
Somebody commented about the community spouse and that it's 154,000, but it does matter if the assets are owned together or if it's in one spouse's name. We didn't go into that kind of detail. So I oversimplified the community spouse and the $154,000 we talked about. So that's one thing you need to talk to someone like Dawn about, is exactly what is the community spouse allowance, who should own the residence, who should not own the residence. Dawn, do you want to make do you deal with that sort of thing?
And to turn that over to the attorneys. I can
Yeah.
have general information, but I recommend that they be working with attorneys on that.
Yep. Right. Somebody made the comment, probably a good idea to transfer assets into a trust regardless of long-term care to avoid probate. That is correct, although the kind of trusts we're talking about tonight are irrevocable trust. most usually when we're talking about avoiding probate, we're talking about revocable trust. But irrevocable trust also avoid probate. But your point of we should be avoiding probate, that is correct. And trusts are a good way to do that. Just make sure you know which kind of trust you're setting up. Another question was, do you have any experience with ladybird deeds or 1% deeds? I think ladybird deeds are a type of life estate deed. And I can talk a little bit about Ohio on this, and that is you can do a life estate deed. So like if I own a farm, I could keep the life estate and I could give what's called the remainder interest to Peggy. And that helps protect the farm. But my life estate interest is still a countable asset. So life estate deeds will help with long-term care, but at least in Ohio, it's not an absolute solution. Ladybird deeds have some specific language. I know they don't work in Ohio. Dawn or Darlene, are you familiar? Okay. And you also talked about the 1% deeds. I'm not sure what that means, but one strategy I have used with people is maybe mom and dad want to gift away their land. They just feel like that's the right strategy. So maybe we'll set up an LLC, put the land in an LLC, and then maybe they'll gift 99% of it and they'll keep 1% ownership. So that 1% is still at risk, but we'll make decisions like selling land require a unanimous consent. So they've protected 99% of the farm, but they have maintained some control through the entity agreement. So if that's what you mean by a 1% deed, yeah, those can be effective. Don, I'm going to let you take this one if you can. We've got the comment on the American Council of Aging website. I see 3 types of Medicaid. Which one applies normally? I'm trying to look up income and asset levels. And then the 3 different types are institutional/nursing home, Medicaid waivers, home and community-based services, regular Medicaid, aged, blind, and disabled. Are you familiar with those?
Not the regular Medicaid. And the other 2, the community-based and the institutional, I'm not positive whether the asset limits are the same for them. I'm not sure on that one, but the regular Medicaid, it's not what we're talking about. That is if someone is just not making an income and are applying for medical assistance for their medical care, that's a different situation.
Yes. Right. Okay. We got a thanks from that person. So I guess we answered it well enough for now. But, you know, I don't consider myself an expert in Medicaid because, in my opinion, it's very technical and it's very easy to make things worse. So I tell people, go to somebody that does this all the time. What are your thoughts on that? Do you share that experience?
Yes. I mean, I try to stay on top of it. Usually the state, your particular state, do a little digging. You can find online the handbook for Medicaid. So you want to make sure you're looking at long-term care Medicaid, which typically includes the community waiver as one of the options. And honestly, beyond that, I tend to, sometimes I'll be talking to nursing home people that handle it because they're dealing directly with the county that's doing the approval process. In Pennsylvania, it's through county offices. So there's definitely questions that I go talk to them.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm sure there's attorneys that are I don't I'm not the deciding factor for anybody, but I try to help guide them as, get ready to speak with an attorney and do planning.
In Ohio, it's also county offices that do that. And kind of along those lines, if somebody, their parents look like, maybe start having some dementia or health issues, so it looks like they may need some long-term care, what do you recommend? Where do you start? Do you go to your county office? Do you contact someone like you? What's a good place to start?
Actually, personally, I would start with your doctor, your family doctor. The problem is you need to arrange to meet with them without the person that you're concerned about, especially if there's dementia. So I'm POA for a friend of mine who doesn't have family in the area, and got the sense some cognitive impairment was developing. And I called her doctor and said, I need to sit down with you and tell you what I'm seeing. What are you seeing, et cetera, and start talking about it. And that was where we started. They're going to be the ones that are going to have to complete papers, help you. I mean, her situation, we started with neuropsych eval and an appointment with a neurologist. Like, let's see what's really going on. Is there some medical cause, lab work, things like that? And so there can be medical reasons for various situations, or that doctor may be managing the individual's health already, and kind of help you sort out what level of care they might need. A case manager coming in can help assess things, and nurse case managers or social work case managers are good at assessment. I'm seeing, you can look for a geriatric care manager if you Google to see who's in the area. I am starting to see some individuals who have worked as certified nursing assistants starting to do some of that work. I'm concerned that you need a professional that is professionally trained to assess. But if I go in and meet with someone, it can be the mail's piling up and they're not handling their mail or various things. Just a professional going in and talking with sometimes will get information that they're not showing the family, or begin to just see, is there something really going on, and can make some suggestions about how to proceed. But honestly, usually my first contact might be with their family doctor. Saying that, I'm sitting here thinking, how often do farmers go to the family doctor? Probably not too often. So might be different.
Dawn, I have a question about, if you are thinking that you need to enter into a facility, how transparent are facilities on the costs, and how easy is it to compare when you're trying to make that choice between one facility and another?
Comparing costs, they're very transparent. They'll show you what their costs are. Some of them even publish it on their website. It's so much per day rate for various levels of service. If they don't have it explicitly on their website, they usually have, you can call and ask, and they'll email it to you. Sometimes you have to put in, your email address, and they'll send it to you. So in terms of cost, that's not difficult to get. Sorting out quality of the facility or the service, that can take a little more digging, but publicly available information is where I start. If you find out who licenses skilled nursing or personal care, whatever you're looking for in your state, then go to their website. They typically publish the inspection reports for skilled nursing facilities, for example. You can see every inspection that those people have had and what the findings were and how that was resolved. So that's one of the first places I look. And the second place that I look, you may laugh at this, Facebook reviews and Google reviews. Yes, there will be occasionally an outlier, like I had this terrible experience. I'll read them, kind of get the general piece of it, the gist of it. Usually in my experience, those reviews pretty much match up with the inspection reports. And then of course, word of mouth, around people's experiences. But, I've done reviews for family members who didn't live near me, but I could spend a couple of hours on the computer and narrow down the list of facilities for them to consider. The nursing home statistics, at least on Pennsylvania, will tell you how many hours of nursing care per day that facility is providing. That can be an important statistic to look at as well. Nonprofit versus for-profit, something else to see.
Well, it's time to start wrapping up. Any final questions from the audience? Don, any final comments from you that you'd like to make?
Just planning ahead. Better to have planned ahead and considered, if you're thinking that someone might need care, to begin to thinking about, well, if they need care, where would we like to be? Where would start to investigate? Better that you do that and not need the information. That can make a big difference.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Peggy, do you want to wrap things up?
See any further questions or comments in the chat? So this webinar is recorded, and so we will have that recording available, and we'll be letting, I know we had some registered who did not attend tonight, so we'll send that out, but you'll be able to find the recording if you want to come back to this on the farm office website. It will be on the page with our long-term care guide, which is under our business resource. No, estate planning, I'm sorry, estate planning resources. So you'll be able to come back and revisit this. And with that, I'd like to thank both Darlene and Dawn. Darlene, thanks for making the connection with us from Pennsylvania and all that you do to help provide this information to those farms over in Pennsylvania who are dealing with this issue. And thanks to you, Dawn, for joining us. It's really interesting to try to, I tend to think of everything so legally, but now to bring in the nursing side of it and the care management side of it, that was just such an interesting and helpful connection to make. So thank you for doing that for us, Dawn. All right, so with that, thank you, everyone. We're glad you attended, and we hope you found some useful information here for the future.